Hello and welcome. I'm Donna Friesen. This is live coverage of the 2022 federal budget. Now, I know talking about budgets can make a lot of people's eyes glaze over, but please stick with us. The financial decisions being announced today in Ottawa will affect you and every Canadian, and we're going to bring it all to you as it happens. This is the Liberal government's first budget since it was re-elected last fall. That government, of course, made a lot of spending promises in the campaign, and we'll be looking for details on how they're going to deliver those promises. We're expecting three major themes today: climate change, housing affordability, and Canada's role in the world. This is the first budget since the Liberals and the NDP struck a deal last month with the intention of keeping the Liberal minority government in power until 2025. That deal, of course, comes with some strings attached. The NDP will be expecting the Liberals to follow through on some NDP ideas, including income-tested dental care, we expect, a surtax on banks, that was a promise made in the election, and eventually universal national pharmacare. Of course, Russia's war in Ukraine has made the whole world pay attention to defense spending. It is expected there will be a big injection of money into defense today, and we expect the cost of living to be addressed somehow today as well. So many Canadians, of course, struggling to afford a home, even to put food on the table. This is Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's day. We expect to see her and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, very shortly, walking down those steps into, oh, there she is, on cue. There they are, walking into the House of Commons.
We know there is a lot of spending in this budget. How will you pay for this? What type of growth are you looking at? Those types of things.
Well, this is a budget that is first and foremost about continuing to have Canadians' backs. We've demonstrated through the pandemic that one of the best ways to make sure our economy comes back strong is by investing in the right things for Canadians, to grow the economy, to support green jobs, to support Canadians on housing. These are the sort of things, and it's done in a fiscally responsible frame.
Yeah, and let me just really emphasize, this is a very fiscally responsible budget. We are showing a steadily declining debt to GDP track, a steadily declining deficit. Canada has, in this budget and today and going forward, the lowest debt to GDP in the G7 and actually the lowest deficit in the G7.
Monsieur Trudeau, en français, vous dites quoi aux Canadiens qui voient leur pouvoir d'achat baisser de jour en jour? Est-ce qu'il y a des solutions aujourd'hui?
All right, they're just going to walk into the House of Commons there. This will be Chrystia Freeland's tabling the document right after 4 p.m. Eastern. That's when the markets have closed. And once she begins delivering that budget document to MPs, we can reveal all the details of what's in it. Of course, we heard a little bit there. Let's go to Mercedes Stevenson, who has been listening into that. Mercedes, right off the bat, they don't usually talk going in, by the way. They usually just kind of go right in there. But I mean, making a point right off the bat, fiscal responsibility, right? They know that that is one of the biggest criticisms of this government.
Well, isn't it interesting that that's the tone they're taking on their way in? Because that has not been the tone that this government has taken on the way into the past budgets. And in particular, budgets and fiscal updates since COVID, which have been tremendously big spending. So I think it's interesting that the message they chose to give to the public, to the Canadians who are watching this at home and listening at home as they head into the House of Commons, is get ready for fiscal responsibility. And we'll see what that means in terms of how that all plays out with the budget. But it's a very different tone and message than I think perhaps a lot of people were expecting for them to walk in with. That's the tone and message people might expect from the Conservatives. So it'll be very interesting to see what that means for the budget when we're able to show you that.
Which will be shortly. I suppose, Mercedes, that they've been hearing, as MPs have been hearing from constituents across the country, how many people are struggling right now that are forced to be fiscally responsible in their own lives. So it would be, I guess, a little tone deaf for this government not to recognize that.
Well, it's just a huge, huge issue as we're talking about inflation, and everybody can see how expensive things have gotten. You go to the grocery store, you can't miss it. Trying to buy a home, trying to buy appliances, everything is getting more expensive. And that's something the Liberals are likely going to have to pay attention to. It has been one of the biggest Achilles heels they've had, with the Conservatives able to go after them and the NDP from different political perspectives, but the same criticism. And it's a political topic that resonates with Canadians because everybody understands the difficulty of trying to pay your bills. It's very personal. It is politics that hits home, and there's not always a lot of that. So I can't imagine that this is a government that could afford to ignore that going into this budget. And something we are expecting to see, and that they have been signaling, is that there is going to be some kind of measures in here likely to address affordability, to address inflation potentially, although it's hard to do. A lot of that is coming from what's called supply side shocks. That means things like supply chain issues due to COVID, or, for example, the war with Russia attacking Ukraine, interfering with the ability to ship grain, interfering with some pretty critical food shortages there that could start to impact our system and our costs soon. But it certainly is a big political issue for this government.
Mercedes, how much is the deal between the Liberals and the NDP to keep this government in power, the minority government in power till 2025, likely shaped Chrystia Freeland's approach to this budget?
I'm really curious to get a look at that, Donna, when we talk about it. We've seen some of it, by the way, here to be, straightforward with our viewers, but we're not allowed to talk about it before it lifts. But it's a really interesting question, because heading into this, we were wondering, does it mean that the Liberals are potentially going to have to displace some of their platform priorities in order to accommodate the NDP? All the signaling that we were getting publicly is that we were not going to see pharmacare or dental care in this budget beyond for children under 12, potentially of a certain income subset of families. That was what was being discussed with the NDP. Just because you don't see it in this budget doesn't mean you won't see it in coming budgets if it's not in here. But we will have to see exactly how that deal is played out, and of course, whether the NDP are ultimately happy with what's in this budget.
All right, I believe we're looking now. Those were file pictures before. This is live now from the House of Commons. This is the Speaker of the House of Commons. And this is the tabling of the federal budget.
Orders, consideration of Ways and Means motion number 3 concerning the budgetary policy of the government.
Ms. Freeland, seconded by Mr. Boissonnault, moves that this House approve in general the budgetary policy of the government. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
That's Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister, delivering her second budget.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, I would like to table in both official languages the budget documents for 2022, including the notices of Ways and Means motions. Les détails concernant les mesures sont exposés dans ces documents.
The details of the measures are set out.
All right, so now that the Finance Minister is on her feet and is beginning to deliver the budget, inform MPs about it, we can also tell you what is in it. I believe we can go to David Akin, who is live at the House of Commons today. I think, David, you're in the foyer there, or just downstairs from the foyer of the House of Commons. You've been going through the documents all day. Go for it. Give us the highlights.
Yeah, as you were just saying with Mercedes, affordability and housing is a big issue. Every year, about 200,000 homes are built in Canada. The government today is committing to double that to 400,000. And in this budget, they're setting aside just under $2 billion this year to do just that.
There's basically a significant gap between the housing we need and the housing stock that we have. This is a down payment towards that. It's going to take cooperation, federal, provincial, municipal, as well as the builder community.
In the meantime, Canadians who have what the government calls, quote, housing affordability challenges may be eligible for a new one-time only payment of $500. When and how that will be done, TBD. Those building a secondary suite in their home, sometimes known as a granny suite, will be able to get a new tax credit of up to $7,500. There's also a raft of new measures to help first-time home buyers, and the most popular is sure to be a new tax-free first home savings account. Each person can put up to $8,000 a year into this account to a lifetime maximum of $40,000. And any contribution to the home savings account will be tax-free going in and will be tax-free coming out. Mind you, this won't be in place until next year. In place now, though, doubling of the first-time home buyer's tax credit to $10,000. That will apply to any purchase made since January the 1st.
And over here we have the electrical panel.
The government also plans a home buyer's bill of rights, guaranteeing the right, for example, to a home inspection prior to purchase. And, as promised in their election platform, the Liberals will ban foreign investment in residential real estate and make sure that property flippers and speculators are paying their fair share of tax.
This is the most ambitious housing plan to tackle supply any Canadian government has ever put forward. And it's also just a first step.
The government is also taking its first step towards a national dental care plan. This is one of the initiatives pushed by the NDP. To start, the government promises to cover the dental care costs for all kids under 12 who live in a household with income of less than $90,000, and that will start this year, helping 90,000 kids. The government is also funding a 2-year pilot project to provide free menstrual products. And while this budget keeps an eye on job growth and fighting climate change with smaller incremental programs, there is relatively significant spending on Indigenous programs, an extra $2.5 billion this year, including $650 million on housing and $460 million on health care in Indigenous communities.
I think it's a prudent budget. It's a modest budget, and I think it's consistent with the uncertainty that Canada's facing.
All right.
Now then, Donna, what's the bottom line on all this? Well, as Minister Freeland said on the way in, she's trying to be fiscally responsible. And so when you put all these measures together, it only means an extra net new spending of just $7 billion, just $7 billion. And that's on a budget of $450 billion. So not much more red ink. The deficit this year is going to be about 2% of GDP, and the deficit is going to shrink to less than 0.5% of GDP, almost balanced, by 2027. Donna.
Well, those sound like promising numbers, David, or just on the surface at least. You know, you've done a lot of these budgets. I think you said you've been in 20 budget lockups over the years. What stands out most in this one? I mean, I heard the finance minister there say the housing policy, for example, was the most ambitious ever mounted by a government.
Yeah, and we'll see if it is. They have promised to double the number of homes built. Will they be able to do that? And again, it's a 5-year plan. You know, in every budget I've ever covered, ahead of the budget, governments tend to spin the narrative, what they want to talk about. And I think Mercedes can talk about this, I can talk about this. We've been led to believe there would be some big increases in defense spending, some really big increases spending on housing, more on inflation. But in fact, when you look through the budget, I mentioned that net new spending of $7 billion. It's a very modest budget. It is not, I think, what people might have expected, given the New Democrats and Liberals had done this deal, and everybody thinks the NDP are spend crazy. Conservatives been worried that this was going to put us in some big red ink. It is, in fact, as Minister Freeland said, we are reducing the debt to GDP ratio. We were talking to experts in the budget who's saying it's really putting the Canadian finances sort of back to pre-pandemic levels. So again, a very modest budget. That's what struck me most about this, was not a lot to write home about, again, except for some of these housing measures, a $500 one-time payment, that tax-free home savings account. Boy, I'll tell you, it's going to be as popular as the tax-free savings account, the TIFSA. When that gets going, the home savings account, I can see a lot of Canadians thinking this is a great way to save for a home tax-free.
David, there's a lot on affordability here. What about timelines, though? Is that tax-free home buyer savings account immediate? I mean, will people be able to take advantage of things in this budget right away?
It is an urgent need, there's no question. I mean, we've got all sorts of stories about people who just cannot afford to buy a home, rent a home. But this is not immediate. It's going to take about 10 months to set up. What is immediate is that doubling the first home buyer's tax credit, that was for any sale after January the 1st.
Okay. David Akin, I hope to speak to you a bit later. Thanks so much. I think we're going to go now to interim opposition leader Candice Bergen, the Conservative Party leader, and her reaction.
What did we see, and what are we seeing in this NDP Liberal budget? Well, we are seeing out-of-control spending, no plan for long-term growth or productivity. We are seeing taxes go up, which in the end, Canadians, everyday Canadians, will be paying for. And we're seeing a housing program announced, as in typical Liberal fashion, that will actually result in not one house built or one house purchased this year. It is an irresponsible budget. It is a typical classic NDP spend and tax budget. Another thing to observe is with every budget that these Liberals deliver, they spend more, which results in the cost of everything going up. So I'm very concerned that with their increased spending, everything will continue to go up. It's not a good budget. It's an irresponsible budget. Conservatives will not be supporting it, and we will be doing all we can to work for Canadians to see taxes decreased and Canadians supported through a very difficult time of increased inflation.
Did you like the more money for defence?
Well, we like the announcement of more money for defence. We have to see if it will actually happen. We already have a government that has announced about $10 billion in defence spending that they actually haven't spent. So, yes, we actually passed a motion yesterday that asked for an increase in defence spending. So we're glad to see it in the budget, but we're going to be looking for where they're going to be spending it and that they'll actually get that money out. Well, that's a lot of money, but we'd rather see.
All right, let's go back to our Auto Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, of course, the Conservatives are not going to support this budget. We knew that right out of the gate here. But calling it out of control spending, calling it irresponsible, that, you know, the housing program, which Chrystia Freeland has described as the most ambitious of any government, will not result in one single house being built. You know, it's hard to know, as Canadians listen to this, where the truth lies, right?
I feel like they had their messaging written before the budget and they stuck to that messaging regardless. It's been messaging that they feel is successful for them. There's no question that there are things in this budget that a Conservative government likely wouldn't have done and that they ideologically disagree with. But compared to previous budgets or how we expected this budget, and all of the financial and fiscal experts who we're talking to and economists are saying it is a fairly modest budget. It is not a ton of new spending, as you heard from David Akin there. But this is, of course, an NDP Liberal budget. So no matter what, from a political perspective, the Conservatives are going to come out and oppose it. They're there to poke holes in it. In fairness, they're the official opposition. That's their job. But it's interesting because I think they have more of a challenge potentially with poking holes in this. But there's some that will be there. For example, healthcare spending isn't in this. Those transfers to the provinces that the provinces have been very vocal about wanting, not in this budget, Donna. That's something that, you know, the Conservatives might find some ground with. There are things, but I feel like that initial response you're seeing is sort of the hardline ideological positions that we see on Parliament Hill.
All right, Mercedes, I want to come back to you, but I think we have some details on the defence spending. I believe Abigail Beeman was looking into that today in the budget lockup. Can we roll Abigail's piece and get some detail?
The headline, $8 billion in new defence funding over 5 years, but the details are extremely blurry. $6.1 billion comes with a major focus on North American defense and modernizing NORAD, a pledge to continue with NATO commitments in Europe, and a major defense policy review to determine what Canada's military needs to be able to do in a changing world.
Might be enough money to have done one of those three things, but it's definitely not enough money to adequately address all three of those items.
A senior government source says the lack of clarity is because more work needs to be done with allies, and Canada doesn't want all its cards on the table.
Well, I think it's predicated on the review. And I think how this money is going to roll out probably is going to be a result of that work done at the front end. It's probably the right way to do it.
The big question, of course, will Canada get close to the 2% of GDP spending target set by NATO? It won't. In 5 years, Canada will hit 1.5%.
It sends a very different and much less forceful message to our allies, as well as adversaries, about how committed we are.
The new money means the Department of National Defence's budget will climb from about $25 billion in 2021-22 to more than $40 billion in 5 years. There are some specifics over the next 5 years: $245 million to support culture change, including modernizing the military justice system. Nearly $1 billion for Ukraine, including $500 million in the first year for military aid.
Government's planning to spend that kind of money on equipping Ukraine. That's great, but it'd be great to see that level of urgency being put towards equipping the Canadian military.
The government says Canada has announced more than $1.2 billion in direct aid for Ukraine and up to $1.6 billion in loans. And in the same chapter, this budget promises to clarify the Foreign Affairs Minister's ability to seize, forfeit, and dispose of assets held by those sanctioned. Think Russian oligarchs. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
And Mercedes is with me. Again, Mercedes, $8 billion in defense spending over 5 years won't get us to the 2% target of GDP that NATO has been, well, that NATO set back in 2014. We have never met that target, and I guess we're not going to this time either. What's your sense of this part of the budget?
It's a lot less than a lot of the experts were expecting, and it's sort of been out there in the political buzz around Ottawa. Most of the money is going to NORAD modernization. That's the defense of North America, and that has to happen for Canada to maintain its sovereignty and security rather than just having the U.S. decide to make defense decisions for us. The NATO commitments listed in the budget were ones that were already announced by the government. The defense policy review is quite interesting to me, and it makes a lot of sense, Donna, because deciding what your military should be doing is a decision you should make before you just pour money into it. The other thing I'm hearing that they ran into, the government, as they were deciding what to do with this, is warnings from experts. Because the Canadian procurement system is very slow and often described as being broken by the experts, simply pouring money into it wouldn't fix it. Same issue with the military. They have a big problem with recruitment and retention, especially of people like sergeants who have, say, 15 years in, a lot of experience, a lot of mentoring, leaving. You can't replace that quickly, and throwing money at it isn't a solution. Certainly, they will continue to be under pressure from the United States government and NATO, who have been asking Canada to spend more and more. But in a budget like this, where they're trying to deal with potential economic shocks, they weren't going to get near the requirement for 2%, which would be about $15 to $20 billion a year. So, Mercedes, you know, events overtake governments all the time, and they have to be prepared to pivot. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what do you think that has done to the calculations in this budget and the decisions that were made? I mean, it can't have been easy. You know, we all listen to Ukraine's president ask for more from the West, asking for the West to show leadership. And, you know, there's a real sense among a lot of people that the West hasn't done nearly as much as it can, that Canada hasn't done as much as it can. What are you hearing about how much that's played into the decisions on defense spending in this budget? Well, I think it's played into the decisions on defense spending in terms of driving them. Speaking to senior officials in the military and politics, there was no sense this was a government that was looking to put a lot of money into defense. It hasn't been a priority for them. But what's happened with Russia attacking Ukraine has really made it clear that not only does Canada have national security concerns and international obligations, but its allies expected to do things. I heard one senior defense official describe Canada's north as NATO's northern front. What are we doing up in the Arctic? Not very much, and there's nothing really in this budget substantial to address that. But that created political pressure and a political risk for the government because they hadn't spent and because the military is under-resourced and overstretched. So they're trying to cover off that vulnerability by putting money in here. They're also trying to help Ukraine by sending some money there. We simply don't have enough equipment to be sending large amounts to Ukraine and still able to function as a military here. So they found sort of that middle ground of sending money over. But there's another effect here too, Donna, and that's the oil and gas effect. That makes things more expensive for Canada in some ways when we're trying to get products where now countries are not accepting Russian oil and gas, but it also benefits Canada on the supply side because we are an oil and gas supplier. That has forced the government to take another look at how they're handling that. This is not necessarily a budget where they wanted to go hard over the oil and gas sector, despite their very green, very environmental push and stance, because it still underpins a lot of the money in the federal budget. So that's another calculation that they had to make as they were putting this together. And frankly, just the geopolitical risk, something we heard about from a senior official in the lockup today who kept using the word uncertainty over and over, geopolitical risk and uncertainty. And that is being driven by the war in Ukraine and simply not knowing what is ahead with this global world order that we'd all become accustomed to, which has now been thrown into array. Pardon me, disarray. Disarray, yeah. Mercedes Stephenson, thank you so much. We'll come back to you for a little bit more on what's in the budget, what it means for the average Canadian. I want to go to Sahir Khan. He's Executive Vice President of the University of Ottawa's Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Sahir, lots of promises in this budget, some of
payment over time to affordability, at least that down payment for first-time home buyers, in addition to the credit. So I think that's where there's kind of a clear win for a constituency that's kind of struggled and where maybe the dream of home ownership seem to get a little further and further away and less realistic, has been brought, I think, back into the realm of the possible. I think it's a big thing, and I think for other aspects of this in terms of housing affordability, I think the diagnosis is really clear about supply, but there's a large housing stock, and I think this feels more like a down payment on kind of closing that gap between what Canada needs and what it has in its housing stock. There's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah. Can you explain how the tax-free first home savings account, I think it's called, is different from the existing tax-free savings account?
Well, this you actually get it's tax-free going in and then tax-free coming out, so it's got actually a double benefit to it. And when the money's in, you can actually get a return on a tax-free basis, and then use that for your down payment. So
and I think you have to be under 40, right, in order to start this, right?
But if there are two people trying to buy a house together, we checked this in the lockup, that couple could actually both apply their savings together and put theoretically about $80,000 towards that home. So I think, as David said, this is going to be a very attractive measure. People might choose to put money here instead of a TFSA or RSP or other mechanism, because it does close that gap between desiring to own a home and being able to afford it. And getting that down payment is absolutely critical.
Just one quick question. So I hear critics say, deficits and debts are a tax on future generations that they'll have to pay for all of our spending now. Others say Canada is in a good position to spend right now. How do you assess that?
This is a modest budget. This is fiscally sustainable. I'm surprised, I think, by how fiscally prudent it is, and I think it started with that kind of fiscal anchor in mind and worked backwards. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of kind of down payments on spending areas, whether it's Indigenous, environment, defense, and housing. And I exaggerate, in some cases they're substantial expenditures, but the reality is I think they started with wanting to have a declining debt to GDP track. I think this will be well received by credit markets. I think this is going to be the type of budget that kind of gets us back to the fiscal track before COVID. And frankly, and it's most optimistic, gives the government room over the next 2-3 years to kind of accommodate some of the policy pressures that are before them, whether it's the NDP Liberal deal, the last Liberal platform, or anything that should arise out of the uncertain geopolitical world.
Okay, Sahir Khan, thank you so much. I think do we have a minute to go back to David and Mercedes? So I'm told we don't have time for that. I'm sorry, David and Mercedes. We're going to see you on Global National coming up a little bit later. For our viewers now, here is a recap of this year's federal budget. Analysts have described it, as we just heard, as surprisingly modest. $7 billion in new spending this year out of a budget of $450 billion. This deficit should hit $53 billion with a debt to GDP ratio of 45.1%. If there is a big push in this budget, it's to make housing more affordable. There's help for first-time home buyers, including a new tax-free first home savings account. There are also plans to double housing construction over the next decade, and the government will offer a $500 one-time payment to those facing housing affordability challenges. And on defense, Canada is committing more than $8 billion over 5 years to support NORAD, NATO, and Canada's response to Russia's war in Ukraine. The Liberals are also pledging $300 million this year to launch a dental care program for low-income Canadians, starting with those children under the age of 12. And that is our special coverage of the 2022 federal budget. Lots more in the fine print of this budget, of course, and we'll be looking through that. We will bring you more details on Global National a little bit later. For now, thanks for watching. I'm Donna Friesen.
The world's democracies had worked so diligently to build over more than 76 years. Our rules-based international order, built from the ashes of the Second World War, today confronts the greatest threat. Toughest sanctions ever inflicted on a major economy. Russia has become an economic pariah. But the mutilated people of Bucha, shot with their hands tied behind their backs, have shown us that is not enough. Putin and his henchmen are war criminals. The world's democracies, including our own, can be safe only once the Russian tyrant and his armies are entirely vanquished. And that is what we are counting on the brave people of Ukraine to do. Because they are fighting our fight, a fight for democracy. It is in our own urgent national interest to ensure that they have the missiles and the money they need to win. And that is what this budget helps to provide. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also reminded us that our own peaceful democracy, like all the democracies of the world, depends ultimately on the defense of hard power. The world's dictators should never mistake our civility for pacifism. We know that freedom does not come for free, and that peace is guaranteed only by our readiness to fight for it. That is why we are making an immediate additional investment in our armed forces and propose a swift defense policy review to equip Canada for a world that has become more dangerous. This budget will help provide the fiscal and physical firepower we need to meet any threat that may confront us. And we understand that security includes energy security, which Canada must work to ensure for ourselves and our democratic partners. C'est pourquoi nous investissons immédiatement des fonds supplémentaires dans nos forces armées. C'est également pourquoi nous proposons un examen rapide de la politique de défense pour que le Canada soit prêt à faire face à un monde désarmé plus dangereux. Ce budget fournira les moyens financiers et la puissance physique dont nous avons besoin pour faire face à toute menace qui pourrait se présenter. The convoys of Russian tanks rolling across Ukraine did not change the fundamental goal of this budget, Mr. Speaker. But Putin's attack on Ukraine and that country's remarkable and valiant resistance has reinforced our government's deepest conviction, a line that runs through this budget and in each of the budgets that have preceded it, that the strength of a country does not come solely from the vastness of the reserves of its central bank or from the size of the force in its garrisons. Those do matter, to be sure, but they matter less than democracy itself. They can be defeated. They are being defeated by a people who are united and free, because it is the people of who are every country's real source of strength. That is true in Ukraine, and it is true in Canada. So let me explain what we need if we are to build a strong country here at home. We need housing that is affordable for everyone and investments that ensure an entire generation is not priced out of owning a home. We need to fight climate change so that we can leave our children with a livable planet. We need to face up to the sins of our past and ensure that Indigenous peoples in this country are able to live dignified and prosperous lives. We need a healthcare system that allows people to see a doctor or a dentist and to get mental health care too. We need a society that is truly equal for everyone, because the color of your skin or who you love or where you were born should not dictate whether you get to share in the opportunities that Canada provides. We need a robust tax system that ensures everyone pays their fair share. And we need an economy that allows businesses to grow and create good middle-class jobs where everyone can earn a decent living for an honest day's work. Le courageux peuple ukrainien a fait sortir les plus vieilles démocraties du monde du malaise du 21e siècle. Il nous a rappelé que la force d'un pays vient de la force de son peuple. Et il nous a rappelé que la priorité absolue de tout le monde dans cette chambre devrait être de construire un pays pour lequel nous serions tous prêts à nous battre. C'est sur quoi nous avons travaillé lors des 7 dernières années. Et c'est ce que nous continuons à faire aujourd'hui. The brave people of Ukraine have shaken the world's older democracies out of our 21st century malaise. They have reminded us all that the strength of a country comes from the strength of its people. And they have reminded us that there should be no greater priority for everyone in this House than to build a country that we would all be willing to fight for. That is what we have worked to do these past 7 years, and that is what we will continue to do today.
I'll have a 10-minute question and comment session. The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I notice the minister is wearing conservative blue today. But that does not in any way transform her budget from being the first left-leaning NDP Liberal budget. So, Mr. Speaker, the most pressing issue facing Canadians today is the cost of living, especially the housing affordability crisis. Millions of Canadians have seen their dream of homeownership slip through their fingers, and uncontrolled spending from this NDP Liberal government has had a lot to do with that. Now, the minister's budget includes $10 billion for housing and homelessness, including $4 billion for a housing accelerator that will actually go to municipalities, not to those who wish to purchase homes but can't afford to do so right now. So in her speech, the minister made the following promise. Over the next 10 years, we will double the number of homes we build. Can the minister tell us Mr. Speaker, this is a serious question. Can the minister tell us exactly how many homes she and her government have actually built over the past, say, 7 years, And just the number, please. I know she has to have the number because she made the claim. So again, how many homes has her government built over the last 7 years?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the member opposite, first of all, by pointing to the color of my suit today. I chose it intentionally, and I chose the color of this button. I thought it was important to show my solidarity, and I think the solidarity of everyone in this House. I'm glad to see the member opposite wearing a blue and yellow tie. I've recently learned, in fact, that his roots, like my own family's, are in Ukraine. I'm glad that the member opposite spoke about housing. Maybe that's something else we can all agree on. Housing is the most pressing economic and social issue in Canada today. And that's why it is the centerpiece of this budget, just as early learning and childcare was the centerpiece of last year's budget. What is new and important about this budget, which again the member opposite has helpfully pointed out, is a focus on supply. What is new is an understanding that what we need to do as a country is find ways to tear down the barriers to building more homes. And the member correctly points out that many of those barriers are at the municipal level. There are a lot of former city councillors and mayors in this House. They all understand very, very well that what we need to do is find ways to work together with municipalities, with provinces, with territories, to build more of the homes Canadians need. And we will do it, Mr. Speaker. We got early learning and childcare done, and we are committed over the next 10 years to doubling the new housing starts in Canada.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Mirabel.
Monsieur le Président, le Québec, les provinces, le secteur de la santé du Québec demandent une augmentation du transfert canadien en santé pour que les montants atteignent 35% des coûts du système. Et non seulement, ni pour cette année, ni pour l'an prochain, ni pour l'année d'après et les années qui suivent, on n'a aucune augmentation de transfert en santé, mais on va jusqu'à écrire que si les provinces appellent Ottawa, ce sera, Monsieur le Président, pour se faire conseiller quant à la façon de mieux gérer leur système de santé, de les rendre plus efficaces, Monsieur le Président. Est-ce que le ministre peut me dire pourquoi il pense qu'un gouvernement qui n'a jamais géré un hôpital de sa vie peut mieux gérer les systèmes de santé que les provinces?
L'honorable ministre des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, on comprend très bien que c'est les provinces et territoires qui sont responsables pour notre système de santé canadien, qui est excellent. Et on comprend aussi que le fédéral doit aider le financement du système de santé. C'est pourquoi, et c'est écrit dans le budget, qu'on a juste versé 2 milliards de dollars aux provinces et territoires pour aider les provinces et territoires avec les problèmes que la crise du Covid a créés pour le système de santé. Je veux ajouter que dans ce budget, nous proposons d'investir 45,2 milliards de dollars. C'est un montant énorme pour soutenir les provinces et les territoires par le biais du transfert canadien en matière de santé. Et, Monsieur le Président, c'est une augmentation de 4,8% par rapport à la base de référence.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, the minister has heard from hundreds of experts that have told her, and I'll quote, Mr. Speaker, that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is neither economically sound nor proven at scale, with a terrible track record and limited potential to deliver significant, cost-effective emissions reductions. And yet, despite the IPCC just having released another damning report about the state of the climate crisis, that carbon capture and storage is the cornerstone of the climate efforts here in this budget, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister recognize that the over $2.5 billion that they've allocated for carbon capture and storage is a missed opportunity to build national renewable energy projects like a Western power grid that could put people to work and actually help us create new renewable sources of energy in Canada, which is something we absolutely have to do if we're going to be able to electrify our economy and lower our greenhouse gas emissions?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians at home listening to the proceedings of this House will be a bit confused by what they are hearing, because they've heard a lot about collaboration between progressive parties, and yet on this issue, I must differ from my honourable colleague. I absolutely believe, and our budget is very clear on the value of CCUS when it comes to a realistic, achievable, and attainable emissions reduction plan. The oil and gas sector is part of the Canadian economy, and it needs to be part of our emissions reduction effort. The CCUS plan, which we have worked on collaboratively with our environmental partners, with our oil and gas partners, is a very important part of that plan. It will help Canada reduce our emissions, and that is something that I think all of us agree is essential. The member has spoken about the need to invest in renewable energy. We agree. That's why this budget includes considerable investments in the green transition, building on the vast investments in the green transition our government has hitherto made, including the Canada Growth Fund, which will crowd in private capital for this essential economic transformation.
And we have time for maybe another 30-second question and answer. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This appears, like all the other budgets so far from this government, to be one of lots of spending and good intentions, but no results. The Parliamentary Budget Officer states there's as many Canadians living in vulnerable homes as there were when the government started, despite billions spent. Despite billions spent, the Library of Parliament says GHG emissions are going up every year. The Library of Parliament also says this government has had the 29th worst performance for debt to GDP ratio. Further, their report, The Long Road, says Canada, for the next 30 years, will have the worst economic growth in the OECD. So if non-stop spending and crippling debt hasn't worked so far, what has changed that is going to work now?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I am really sorry to say that the member opposite is simply inaccurately citing statistics. The reality is that Canada's economic growth today is among the strongest in the world. Our GDP grew by more than 6% in the fourth quarter, is on track to grow 4% in the first quarter. Canada's economic recovery is robust, it is remarkable, particularly when it comes to jobs. And in terms of debt to GDP and deficits, Canada is in the strongest fiscal position of any G7 country.
And that's all the time we have for that. The reprise du débat, the Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Where there is no vision, the people perish. Now that is a proverb that one of my Liberal colleagues used earlier today. But it was in a different context. It was in the context of Easter. But the context in which I'm going to use it is a budget that is absolutely bereft of any vision. The budget is bereft of any vision to meaningfully address what currently matters most to Canadians, which is the skyrocketing cost of living and housing affordability crisis. There's no real plan to fight the inflation that has exacerbated this government's tax and spend profligacy. There's no overarching investment into economic growth, no growth plan to improve our productivity and our ability to compete in the global marketplace. There's no grand plan to restore Canada's tarnished reputation as a good place to invest. Right now, we are dead last among the OECD countries when it comes to investment. Nor is there a grand vision to manage the massive debt load that my children and grandchildren will be left to repay, with interest, of course. As with last year's budget, this one fails to put forward a credible fiscal anchor that outlines a clear pathway and a firm target to return to balance. There is no grand vision for restoring Canada's reputation as a trusted middle power amongst the world's nations. Neither is there a serious plan to harness the power and potential of our sustainably produced natural resources to address the environmental challenges facing our world. In short, this budget fails to deliver the visionary leadership that these times call for. Instead, this budget is emblematic of an unserious Prime Minister, an unserious Finance Minister, and an unserious government. Where there is no vision, the people perish. That's from the Proverbs of Solomon, considered among the wisest men ever to walk this earth. We need a vision, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have more to say in the days ahead. But until then, Mr. Speaker, and until tomorrow, I move, seconded by the member for Lethbridge, that the debate be now adjourned.
Mr. Fast, seconded by Ms. Thomas, moves that the debate now be adjourned. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-2, the motion is deemed adopted and the House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.